Welcome to the Locum Strategist podcast. I'm your host, Simon Parsons, and this is the show where we help physicians take control of their skill set and create a life on their own terms by using locum tenens as a pathway to making that happen. My friends, today I have got a wonderful guest. I'm so excited to talk with Stephen Lee, who is a certified public accountant, but get this, he actually focuses on serving physicians who do locum tenens work, which is quite unique. So I was really excited to have him as a guest on my show today. Stephen, how are you doing?
Doing well, Simon. Thank you for having me.
Well, my first question is, how did you get into what you do, and why did you decide to start serving physicians and kind of tilting towards locum tenens? Quite a niche there that you've got.
Yeah, no, excellent question. So the genesis of that is, about a few years ago, I was doing a little bit of a deeper dive into my practice, and I have a private practice, and I was looking at and thinking about the question, who do I enjoy working with? Right? That was the question that I really had to really think through. Because I'm trying to build a lifelong career here, right? And I want to work with individuals that are enjoyable to work with. Let's just say that. And when I analyzed that client list, it was very clear. It was the medical professionals, specifically the locum professionals that I was working with, and so that's how I kind of decided from that point on, I'm going to niche down and really target and try to serve that community is the locum professionals.
I love hearing that. And this is such a fitting episode because I get a lot of questions. And I just wanted to start off with this. One of the most common questions that I get from physicians, and by no means am I an expert, and this is why it's so great to have you on this podcast, is talking about entities and structures, like corporate structures. A lot of doctors, they'll start out and they'll just have it as private income. And then eventually they'll start thinking, yeah, maybe I need to set this up as a business. And one of my questions for you is if you can explain the difference between, my guess is most people gravitate towards an LLC or an S-corp. I really don't know that much about either of those structures. I've gotten a couple LLCs for businesses that I have, but tell me a little bit more about high level, like for somebody who is just like wading into the waters of locum tenens and starting to think about things like this. Tell me a little bit more about corporate entities.
Yeah, great question. That is probably the most common question, right? LLC or S corp, right? That's probably always the question that I get most frequently. Really, it starts off with the LLC, and I recommend highly if you're looking at going into locums, set up an LLC. Do not do it as a sole proprietor. So basically, a sole proprietor is you're operating a business using your own personal social security number. Okay. With that, there's no liability protection or asset protection with that because it's you and the patient, you and the hospital. There's no barrier there. There's no buffer there. So I do not recommend ever if you're going to take your first locums, let's say contract or position, you have the LLC set up right away, and the contract is between you, the LLC, and that hospital, or the LLC and the locums, the intermediary, we'll call it, right? And so you want to have that LLC set up. And the reason why you have the LLC set up is because there's that liability or asset protection. There's that extra layer between you, the individual, you have your LLC, and then you have your patients, you have the hospital, the people that you are servicing. You want that buffer there, right? To really protect all that you've really worked for, your personal assets, right? So you really want to set up that LLC. And some states, and I want to add this in here, Simon, is they require you to set up a PLLC, a professional LLC. That's what it is. So you have to look at your state-specific requirements, okay, to set up whether it's an LLC or a PLLC. Here in Illinois, you need a PLLC, right? And in different states, you might just need an LLC. So what I always recommend is a lot of people do go to, like LegalZoom or Zen Business, all these different online websites. Um, I would actually consult with one of your colleagues, someone in the local who's doing locums that around you in your state to ask them, do I need a PLLC? And then if I do, is there a lawyer that I can grab an introductory call with, right? To really, maybe ask them specifically that knows your jurisdiction, whether to set up an LLC or PLLC, what has to be done. And then later on, Simon, we can get into when does an S corp come into play, right? Because we always hear LLC or S corp, right? And S corp really is, it's a different entity type. It's a different legal entity type. And many times, my locum physicians, they will start off as an LLC or a PLLC. And then when the income level is right, we will switch over to an S corporation, and that's an election that you make. And it's a little bit too deep. We won't go into that election just yet, but really, it's start off with the LLC. Never start with as a sole proprietor. Start with an LLC, and to really get that legal asset protection that you definitely want in place before you start servicing any clients or any
Mm.
patients.
Okay, so really, it sounds like first thing to do is like bypass the sole proprietorship, and then figure out in your jurisdiction if you need a PLLC and an LLC. Really quick before we move on, what is the difference between the two, and why do some states have them, and why? Why? So the states that do have a PLLC, do they also have an LLC? And if
They
so,
do.
what's the difference?
Yeah, great question. So the difference is basically the PLLC for those states that require it. It's for businesses. The states specifically, they have general LLCs, those states, but PLLC for those states are the ones that if your business is operating under a professional license, so that might be like physicians, nurses, CPAs, lawyers, anything that you have a state-specific license, a professional license, those states require, if you're operating a business of that type, if you're going to choose LLC, you need to be a PLLC in that state, not just a regular LLC, but a PLLC. So once again, those states do have general LLCs, like normal LLCs, and they also have PLLCs, and the PLLC is for those that are governed by the professional licensing board of that state, right? So there's different licenses that you need.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying that. So,
Mhm.
a locums physician starts off with an LLC, and then at some point you mentioned that the income may be reaching a certain level where they want to consider an S corp. So, break down for me in layman's term what exactly is an S corp, and why is there? Tell me a little bit more about what point a physician should start considering. It sounds like it's something that you add on to an LLC, or is it like you're transitioning to something completely different?
Great question. Yeah, there's a lot there. First off, let's answer that second half of that question. An S corp is a different legal entity type, okay, than an LLC. So, what I had alluded to before is, um, in the tax code, the reason it's called an S corp, it's under subchapter S of the tax code. Okay, so this is a kind of like under the tax law. Okay, under IRS code, that's why it's called S under subchapter S. Under it's kind of type of corporation, but it's a S corporation. Okay, and with an S corporation, it's very different than LLC in several ways. First off, the administrative burden is higher than an LLC. A reason why we always elect LLC in the very beginning, and I'm going to use LLC and PLLC interchangeably here. So I'll just use the term LLC. And if your state requires a PLLC, just know that I'm talking about your PLLC at the same time. But the S corporation, there are limitations in terms of who can be a shareholder or who can be an owner of that S corporation. For instance, you have to be a US citizen to be a shareholder or an owner, okay? And that might conflict with some of our locum professionals out there, right? They might be here on a green card. They might not be a full out citizen just yet. So an S corporation might not be the ideal type for that type of locums professional. Also, with an S corporation, you have to file a separate tax return at the end of each year or at the beginning of the following calendar year, right? So with a LLC, typically that will just be part of your personal return on the Schedule C. So you're filing one 1040, right? One personal return with your locums practice included in there. With an S corporation, you actually file a separate tax return. It's called an 1120S that flows into your personal return. So you're going to have to file two different tax returns, okay? A personal return as well as an S corporation return. So that's one administrative burden or expense that you have to factor in. A second is there's something called reasonable compensation. And I'll have a future video about that. And what that is one of the requirements of having an S corporation, you have to pay yourself a salary. Okay, you have to pay yourself a salary. And with that salary comes payroll taxes, right? Payroll taxes, there's administrative burdens of filing quarterly forms, annual forms. It's a lot. So what I always recommend is if you are operating or thinking about operating with an S corporation, just outsource that to Gusto, Paychex, ADP. There's a lot of different payroll providers out there. Do not try to DIY that yourself at home, okay? Because it is a lot. And that fraction of a cost that you pay monthly for that payroll service is going to save you hours of time. Okay. So if you're thinking about S Corp or you're doing an S Corp, you have to do payroll. You have to pay yourself a reasonable salary. Okay. Reasonable compensation. And yeah, and so with an S Corp, once again, it's illegal, it's a distinct entity type that's separate than LLC. And the reason I alluded going back to maybe about 5, 10 minutes ago is that sometimes you're allowed to, if you're an LLC or PLLC, you can actually become a hybrid entity. And what I mean by hybrid is for legal purposes, you can be an LLC or PLLC. But for tax purposes, in front of the IRS, you can elect to be an S corporation. Okay, so you become like this hybrid entity, okay, where you're an LLC once again for legal purposes, but for tax purposes, you're viewed as an S corporation. Okay, and that's an election that you make and you send into the IRS. Okay, it's the form 2553. And you definitely don't want to DIY that yourself as well. You want to outsource that to a professional, whether it's a lawyer, a CPA, or a tax specialist. You definitely want to outsource that as well. And yeah, one of the biggest takeaways I want all your listeners to do is I know locum professionals are very intelligent. They know how to do a lot of things, but sometimes I recommend outsourcing a lot of these functions, right? Trying to set up your business, trying to do your own taxes, your own tax return, payroll. Please do not do it. Okay. If you're a locums professional out there, outsource it to someone that can do it much faster. And it's going to save you hours and give you peace of mind when you go down for bed at night. Okay. So really make sure you outsource these things.
I like that because I like to keep things simple. And already when I hear you talking about all these extra forms that need to be done, I'm like, that's not for me. So there must be a benefit. There must be a reason why somebody would want to go through those extra hoops to hire somebody else to do this or to outsource and have a separate tax return. Why the S corp? What's the benefits in doing that? And why would somebody want to go through all those additional steps as opposed to keeping it simple?
Absolutely. So I'm going to talk about the tax savings here. Okay. Really, we're going to narrow on tax savings. There are some legal protections that the S Corp does provide over the LLC, but I won't cover that because I am not a lawyer. But in terms of taxes, that's what we typically talking about, right? Why S Corp versus LLC? It's self-employment taxes. That's what it is. You're saving on
Mm.
self-employment taxes. So, for example, if you are an LLC, you're not an S Corp, you're an LLC or PLLC. Um, each and every dollar that you profit or you show on your Schedule C at the end of the year is subject to self-employment taxes typically. Okay. And the reason why I say typically is because self-employment taxes, another way to think of it is FICA taxes, right? So we've all received a W-2 in the past. That W-2, there's this line called FICA, or sometimes it's broken out Social Security tax, Medicare tax, right? That's what FICA is. It's a combination of those two things. As a self-employed or an LLC, you don't have payroll, right? We don't have that requirement to have reasonable compensation. So instead of that, by default, you'll be subject to self-employment taxes, okay? Up to a certain extent, and I won't go into all the numbers, but typically most of your money is going to be subject to self-employment tax that you derive from your locums practice, okay? That's the profit number, not the revenue, not the gross revenue, it's the profit number. And that self-employment tax, it's very high. It's 15.3%. Okay. Just remember that number, 15.3%. And that's on top of your income taxes. This is not in lieu of your income taxes. This is in addition to your personal income tax rate, which might be 10%, 20%, 37%, whatever that might be. So think of adding 15.3% to whatever your income tax rate is. You might be in the 40s or 50%, right? Tax rate. So depending on your income level, right? Depending how much income you're deriving from the locums practice, and also you have to look at your household income as well, right? Because a lot of locum professionals, you know this, Simon, they have a W-2 job and they have a locums or 1099 as well, okay? That is a lot more specific because the W-2 job is withholding already some FICA taxes on your behalf, Social Security. Okay, so there's a max on Social Security taxes, which makes up the bulk of that 15.3% that we're talking about. So if that's you, you really have to talk to a tax professional about that to be like, okay, should I stay in LLC or does it make sense to become an S corporation? Okay, because you really have to look at a case by case perspective. Because as a physician or as a nurse or as just a locums professional, every patient is a case by case basis, right? You cannot prescribe, you can't do a blanket prescription on every patient, right? That would not be the correct advice, right? To just give a blanket prescription to everybody that walks through your door. Same thing with taxes. We have to look at your specific circumstance. Do you have a spouse? Do they work, right? Do you have a W-2 on top of your locums practice or, separate from your locums practice, right? We have to look at all the facts here, right? To really know what is the right thing. So the LLC, once again, is subject to self-employment taxes, while the S corporation is different. The S corporation, only your reasonable compensation is subject to payroll
Mm.
taxes or FICA. The rest of the money that's not classified as salary, okay, or reasonable compensation, is considered distributions. And distributions are not subject to that self-employment tax or payroll taxes. Okay, so that's really the big savings here. And the IRS knows this, okay? This is not something that's secret. That is the reason why we're trying to save on self-employment taxes. That's the reason why we do S-corp versus LLC at a certain point. Not everybody should do this just from the very beginning because you always have to weigh the administrative costs versus the tax savings, right? If the administrative costs outweigh the tax savings for doing an S corporation, then it's probably better just to stay as an LLC, not an S corporation, right? So you really have to look at all the different facts and circumstances. But at the end of the day, we're trying to save on self-employment tax assignment. That's the reason why we do an S corporation.
You've explained that beautifully. It finally makes sense to me. So, question for you: if
Sure.
and this may be kind of a personal question as well, but if you're a W-2 employee that also does locums and you hit that Social Security threshold, I think it's probably like 166 or 169,000, and then you no longer have to pay for either self-employment or Social Security tax. Does that mean like say if you hit that threshold and then you also do some contract work or locums work and you're bringing in extra income, are you all good to go after you pay that 166 to 169, or are you gonna have to pay additional on top of that on your additional income?
Great question, Simon. It depends. And I'll give you a clear example here. Okay. So if you are, and I believe for 2024, I believe it's a little shy of 169, 169. And I think it's 168,200 to be exact. That is the Social Security limit, right? Where basically the government can only tax, I think it's like 12.9% of that 15.3 up to 168,200, okay, per person. So this is if you have a spouse in your household who's also earning W-2, they're separate. That's a separate calculation for them, okay? It's not like a household 168 too. It's per worker, right? Per spouse. So for your example, and I have several physicians that have a W-2, and that W-2 is above 168 too. Let's say that it's like 300,000, okay? That W-2 covers all of the Social Security side of the self-employment tax, okay? However, there's something called Medicare tax, right? Which doesn't have a cap like Social Security tax, okay? So remember, out of that 15.3%, about 3% or a little bit less than that is Medicare taxes, and that does not have a cap, okay? So even if you or a physician has a W-2 that's way above and it covers the 168, right? And so you're good on Social Security, but the Medicare tax also still needs to be paid on top of your income taxes if you're self-employed. Okay, if you're self-employed, oh, not self-employed, if you're an LLC. Okay, if you're an LLC, you're subject. There's no cap for that Medicare tax of 3%. So really, let's say I have this one example when I think about a physician, they have a really solid W-2, right? Which fully pays in their Social Security tax, okay? They have a 1099. However, that's in the upper six figures, okay? Upper six figures. So we're talking more than, a couple $100,000, right? just apply 3% to that. Okay. 3% of that because their expenses are very minimal. Okay. So there's not really much offset there, just expense wise. Um, so really 3%, let's say times $500,000. What is that number, Simon? Let's do a little bit of mental math here.
3,000 times
Oh,
500,
3%
3% of
times
500,000.
500,000. Yeah, yeah.
So
Where are we at?
15 grand, right?
15 grand right there, right? That 15 grand you would save if you had an S-corp for your locums practice, okay, instead of just remaining as an LLC. Because even though your Social Security or your self-employment, a good portion of that is covered by the W-2, you would pay an additional 15,000 if you did not have that S corporation in this example. Does
Got
that
it.
make sense, Simon?
Yeah,
So really
absolutely.
depending, yeah, really depending on the facts and circumstances for this individual. And there are a lot of locum professionals who are in sometimes in the seven figures, right, Simon? We know that there's some surgeons out there, some real certain specialties that are in the seven figures. And there are a lot of tax saving strategies to really try to bring that down. But we're really trying to save on that 3%, that Medicare tax, okay?
I
That
love
we
this.
really want to save. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that this is just a great reminder to get a professional to help. Like a lot of times people want to do it yourself, totally get it, but a lot of times that doesn't save you money. So, one more
No.
question for you,
Yeah. Yeah.
before like I have you tell people where they can find you. But this is one of my favorite questions to ask is like from your vantage point, you see things a lot differently than someone like me, or perhaps somebody who's just doing locums or just stepping into that. But when you see somebody's situation that's kind of a novice at this, what would you say are the biggest mistakes or misconceptions where you're just like maybe cringeworthy stuff when you see somebody you're just like, oh, I wish I could help them, but they're doing this. Like, what are some of the biggest mistakes that people make when it comes to taxes or entities?
Yeah. No. First off is set up that LLC, get it in place, right? Rule number one, set up that LLC or PLLC, look at the state rules, set it up before you take a single dollar. Before you sign that contract, right? If you know you're going to have a contract, get that LLC in place. Rule number one, okay? Get that from day one. Once you set up that LLC, go to the bank, set up a separate checking account and a credit card with that new LLC. Okay. And the reason I say that it's so vital, those first two steps, getting an LLC, and secondly, setting up a checking account and a separate credit card for that LLC, is because it will really simplify the administrative burden of gathering your expenses at year end when you're starting to prepare your taxes or prepare your information to give to your CPA, right?
Mm.
Remember, once again, biggest recommendation, get a CPA, right? When you're doing your taxes, right? But during the year, when you're first starting out, to really get organized, get that LLC in place. Secondly, separate business accounts, separate checking account, separate credit card, and only run your non-reimbursed expenses through that credit card. Okay. Because a lot of locum intermediaries, right, places that place you at hospitals or different practices, right? Sometimes the contract will cover some of the travel expenses or a majority of the expenses, depending on the contract, right? But depending on the incentives of that locum position. But if there are non-reimbursed expenses, things that you have to cover, right? Sometimes lodging, travel, car rentals, things like that. That's when you use that new LLC credit card. Okay, run it through there. So at the end of the year, it's all consolidated in one place, right? Some banks, but a lot of banks do a year-end summary by category, right, of your credit card expenses. Be like, hey, you spent X amount on entertainment, X amount in restaurants, X amount with travel. It's done for you. 95% of work is done for you if you just get these separate bank accounts, right? Separate credit card, separate checking account. And remember, the checking account, the reason you have that is because whenever you're being paid from that locums position, have it sent to that LLC checking account, not your personal, to the business checking account. Because once again, the mindset you have to have is you're running a business, you're starting a business. You are a business owner now, not just a locums professional. You are opening a business, okay? You are a business. You have to have that mindset when you start from day one, right before you sign that contract, okay? You have to have that mindset. I am a business owner. Therefore, I need to be an LLC. Okay, typically just starting out. as well as I need to have separate business accounts from my personal accounts. Okay, because we are not the same. There's a business and there's my personal, and I want to protect that as well as operate it separately.
Beautiful explanation and very, very clear steps. All right, my friend. Well, if I was a physician doing locums, you'd be the first person that I want to reach out to, or at least learn a little bit more from. Where can my listeners find you?
It's very easy on YouTube. It's the Locum CPA. That is my channel handle. Just type in the search the Locum CPA. I have a video podcast as well as just a regular podcast. So you can find me on YouTube at the Locum CPA.
Oh, I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Audience, please go over to his YouTube channel, check it out, hit the subscribe button, and watch some of his videos. And then, if you've listened to this episode, you feel like there's some value here that you'd like to share with one of your colleagues, please go ahead and do so. And I would love it if you're on Spotify or if you're on Apple. Please leave me a rating. It just takes a couple of seconds to drop some stars on this episode. Thank you so much, and I will catch you on the next episode.